Other issues or Christians faced other issues in the 19th century that led them to reflect on culture and society, adopt new modes of addressing it. And a lot of this is reflected in the way in which the United States itself began to change. Urbanization, right, the rise of cities, industrialization, led to migration to the cities. And people were moving from the fields to the cities because that's where you can make your money. That's where you can succeed. But with the development of new mechanical ways of doing some forms of labor, there had to be, this response of finding other ways to earn your money. The rise of immigration often led to ethnic ghettos, where society is kind of broken up, and that's where you get your German towns and your Little Italies. Is that as these people immigrated to the United States, they often clustered in places with other people of the same ethnicity. With this rise in urbanization, industrialization, immigration, there were essentially two responses. Some people approved of those changes and other people disapproved. Often there was a lot of fear expressed by people. People fearing the changes that modernization brought. Right? The fears of what goes on in the cities, the fear of what industrialization will bring. Others feared the others arriving in their cities and on their shores. But it's also this time of those great breakaway individuals, the entrepreneurs, the heroic robber barons who amassed sizable fortunes, the times of people like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, and Ford. It was also a time of growing middle class. Capitalism was the order of the day. And in this Gilded Age, there were attempts to make sense of this from a Christian standpoint. Some, like Andrew Carnegie, attempted to, what we might say, baptize the capitalist enterprise. In 1889, he writes a short article called Wealth, and that reflects what some scholars have referred to as the gospel of wealth. For Carnegie, civilization depended on holding private property as sacred, having free competition and the free accumulation of wealth. Wealth was a virtue of the struggle for survival. And so people had taken Darwin's ideas of how species adapt in specific environments and applied it to social situations, what was called social situations, or social Darwinism, which essentially said the class struggle was a struggle for the survival of the fittest, which meant you didn't have to worry about the lower people in society. They obviously were not fit if they could not get out of poverty. But Carnegie said the wealthy had a responsibility to help the poor, to use their wealth for the betterment of society. Ultimately, he said there's three things you can do with your wealth. All right? You can leave it to your family and let them do with it. You can leave it for the public good or public uses at death. Essentially, they're going to tax your inheritance. Or, during your life, you could be philanthropic. Use it for the common good. Develop libraries, cultural institutions, hospitals. Right? And that's why you have things like Carnegie Hall. This attempt to try and provide for the common good. Of course, when you think about it, you have to have the time to go to a library or to a performance at a Carnegie Hall. And given the fact that a lot of people in the lower ends of society were struggling for survival, they didn't have that kind of leisure time to participate in those kind of events. Similar concepts are reflected in the sermons of a man named Russell Conwell, who was a Baptist minister. One of his most famous sermons was Acres of Diamonds, which essentially, the point of the sermon was to say, everything to get rich is in your community. You just need to take advantage of it. And so in Acres of Diamonds, which he preached multiple times, told the story of an Arab who had sold his property to go and find a diamond mine, only to find out later that his house sat on top of one. Right? And so he had sold the property, but there are acres of diamonds out there if you will just go out and get them. You can get rich if you try hard enough, is Cromwell's point. In fact, it's your Christian duty to get rich. There isn't anything pious about poverty, he said. In fact, he told people that most people are poor because they are being punished by God. So why should we help them if they are under God's punishment? This time period has often been referred to as the Gilded Age because it was a time of great prosperity, of lauding of great success. But underneath that gilding was exploitation, poverty, illness, and struggle. The robber barons and others in management often exploited immigrants, children, women, and lower-class workers to make as much money as they could. Which led Christians to respond to that. So on one hand, you have Christians saying, go out, capitalism's great, make your money, get rich, poverty's not holy. In other cases, however, there was a Christian concern about the economic situation of the latter 19th century. Some of this we'll discuss in the 20th, but I want to pause here before we finish to mention the papal encyclical Rerum Novarum. So this is the Catholic response to this in the 19th century. Rerum Novarum was focused on the rights and duties of capital and labor, so the relationships between management and workers. Attempting to address problems in labor, capitalism, and industrialism. Now we're talking here toward the end of the robber baron era and the beginning of the labor strike era, where you see more and more people, labor, working together, this kind of collective bargaining, as well as, if you're not going to change the conditions of how we're working, we're going to strike. So Rerum Novarum focused on a variety of things related to this relationship between capital and labor. And so it starts off with Leo XIII addressing the long hours, the dangerous work that labor often faced in society. Quote, a small group of very rich people have been able to throw upon the masses of poor laborer a yoke that is little better than slavery itself. So what's the solution to this? Well, in the 19th century, one of the things that was proposed to address this issue was socialism. You have Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and others talking about socialism as a way to address this distance between management and labor. But for Leo, socialism was not a good solution. Instead, he defended private property. There are problems with capitalism, but private property was important. It was a God-given right. So what was necessary? What was necessary in Rerum Novarum was that the church and the government work together to make life better. Cooperation needed to exist between employers and employees. And so Leo encouraged labor unions, workman's comp in the case of injury, regulation and oversight, and even to some extent, some welfare provisions. Things that all exist now that we kind of take for granted if you work on a job, but were not in existence in the 19th century. As Leo quotes, among the several purposes of a society, one should be to try to arrange for a continuous supply of work at all times and seasons, as well as to create a fund out of which the members may be effectually helped in their needs, not only in the cases of accident, but also in sickness, old age, and distress. Ultimately here, though, Leo sides with capitalism. He's advocating for people to be charitable, take care of the poor. But ultimately, in Leo's mind, the church should be focused on rescuing and rehabilitating the system, not dismantling it, not taking it apart. ultimately, why is Leo so concerned about this? Well, probably because a large, those masses under the yoke of the very rich in the United States were immigrant Catholics under the control of rich Protestants. And so they migrated to the United States. They're immigrants, unskilled workers, right? They were the ones being exploited. If it had been the other way around, would he have been as concerned? But there are still some very important Catholic social issues here. In fact, Leo goes as far to say, in contrast to Russell Conwell, God seems to lean in favor of those who suffer misfortune. Later, Catholic theologians would refer to this as God's preferential option for the poor. Questions or comments about culture and society in the 19th century? Right. Let's turn to the development of doctrine. The 19th century was a period of great doctrinal innovation. Now, it's not that the people of the 19th century were more innovative than in previous centuries, but some of the barriers that prohibited doctrinal innovation no longer existed. In previous years, in many of the Western European countries, for example, if you tried to develop a new doctrine, tried to teach a new teaching that was out of sync with Catholicism or Protestantism, you would have been stopped by the clergy. You would have been stopped by the state. Right? And so there's no heresy suppressors other than kind of peer pressure, rationalistic debate. Right? You can try and say things about it, but you don't have that pressure of government, pressure of law to stop heresy or the different doctrinal things that are developing. Not everything was innovative or new, but often there were different expressions of these ideas that had been held previously. One new, in a sense, idea in the 19th century was the emphasis on restoring the ancient church, sometimes referred to as restorationism or primitivism. You're looking for the primitive or original apostolic church. In some sense, this idea of the return to the apostolic church wasn't new. Catholics, of course, claimed to be the original church. Many Protestant reformers also thought of themselves as restoring the apostolic church. In the late 18th and early 19th century, however, a couple of strands came together. Historical developments, cultural trends that came together in a new way that led to the development of a new movement. One of those strands was the development of Scottish common sense, which we talked about in the 18th century. Taking Bacon's method, that inductive way of looking at society, and applying it through common sense realism to the Bible. Now, both the focus of the Baconian method and common sense had been on nature and reality. How do we know something is real? How can we tell how nature works? Well, you inductively examine the facts, and then you can trust your senses. Well, Protestants, across the board in the United States especially, but also in Great Britain, saw important consequences for what this meant about understanding the Bible. The Bible becomes, when shaped by the Scottish common sense method, a storehouse of facts that you would inductively explore to discover truth. So, for example, if you wanted to know the truth of something, you looked at all the instances in the Bible where it was referred to, and then you drew out general principles. Now, the Bible has always been true for Christians, right? Augustine believed that it was true. And people before Augustine believed it true. Throughout the Middle Ages, people believed it was true. But this is a different way of how the Bible is true. The Bible becomes true as you discover truth by examining facts and drawing principles. Another strand in this development was a anti-creedal or anti-traditional outlook. Now, in a sense, here too are some things from Protestantism. The Protestant reformers attempted to get rid of traditions that did not have scriptural warrant, and had even rejected the historicity of some of the traditional creeds or statements of belief. But Protestants weren't totally against statements and confessions of faith. The Westminster Confession of Faith, for example. While these creeds, or confessions, or catechisms, might not have been originally intended as comprehensive, right, to cover everything, by the 19th century, they were used as a measurement of orthodoxy. For Presbyterians, for example, how well you measured up against the Westminster Confession of Faith said a lot about who you were as a minister. And if you held beliefs that were in opposition to the Westminster Confession of Faith, you would not be ordained as a minister, or you would be removed from your post. Well, there were people in the 19th century who began to be concerned because they felt that not everything in these creeds accorded with biblical teaching. There were things that were often in opposition. A third strand in all of this was a negative approach to biblical silence. We talked about this back in the Reformation. That's literally an approach that said, if it's not in Scripture, it's not permitted. And so in attempting to restore the New Testament church, if Scripture was silent about something, it was forbidden. It was not to be practiced. A fourth strand, coming from Great Britain, but especially in the United States, was this focus on anti-elitism and emphasizing individualism. This is kind of the American component. A lot of the first three had been shaped by European experience. But this fourth one was shaped by the American context. Frustration with and denigration of the educated elite ministers and priests was expressed throughout the United States in the wake of the Revolution. In the early republic of the United States, there were many who rejected the idea that Christian ministers needed to be educated at a university or college, or needed to be licensed by a denominational authority. Many believed that anyone who received a call could be a minister. Furthermore, people became convinced that an individual could interpret and understand the Bible for oneself. A minister or a priest wasn't needed. Now, the Reformers had emphasized the need of interpreting Scripture and individual importance, but they said that needs to be done in the context of Christian community. Right? That you work with other Christians to determine truth, not just kind of go off on your own. By the 19th century, however, this was abandoned by a sizable group of people. We talked in the 18th century of how in the aftermath of the Revolution, there was this way in which, without the state control, there's this flowering of religious groups. And so it allowed for the development of all sorts of groups, some of which we'll talk about on Tuesday. But others became very concerned and disturbed by this confusion that developed, this fracturing of Christianity. Wanted to find ways in which people could cooperate. How can we work across denominational lines with people who had similar ideas? Some even became convinced that the denominational lines themselves were the problem. Right? By identifying yourself as a Baptist in contrast to a Methodist or a Presbyterian, there's something distinct and separating about that.